What if the worst day of your life didn't come with thunder or screams? What if it came quietly, like a whisper you didn't notice until it had already taken everything? This isn't a story about sudden disaster. It's a story about slow loss, about a man who seemed to have it all, a good job, a family, a little girl who thought he hung the stars, but who woke up one day and realized he was completely lost. Not to the world, but to himself. This is a story about silence, about the kind of pain that doesn't scream, about the kind of faith that doesn't break in half, but crumbles piece by piece, until all that's left is a single question from a child. Daddy, is God even real? And sometimes it takes that question to start the journey back home. I was 38 years old when my world quietly fell apart. There wasn't a dramatic explosion, no shattering scream in the middle of the night, no earth-trembling event that marked the precise moment everything changed. No, it was much subtler than that. My life unraveled in silence, like a house slowly rotting from the inside, while the paint on the outside still looked just fine. To most people, I had everything. A well-paying job in a downtown Chicago consulting firm, a wife who had once loved me deeply, and a bright, precocious 7-year-old daughter who looked up to me with eyes that seemed to ask, "Daddy, is the world good?" And every day I lied to her with my silence, because I didn't know the answer anymore. I used to be a believer. I mean that in both the spiritual and emotional sense. I believed in hard work, in marriage, in dreams, and I believed in God. I was raised in a small Baptist church in Peoria, Illinois, one of those places where every Sunday smelled like old hymn books and fresh-baked banana bread. Mama used to sing in the choir, her voice soft and worn like an old prayer. My father, stern but faithful, never missed a service. I used to sit between them in the pew, legs too short to touch the floor, thinking life was something solid, something you could build brick by brick. But somewhere between growing up and growing older, that faith began to slip through my fingers. College came, then grad school, then a job, and suddenly Sunday mornings were for catching up on sleep. I told myself I didn't need church to be good. I didn't need God to be moral. I just needed ambition, discipline, and a little bit of luck. And for a while, that formula worked, or at least it looked like it did. My marriage to Allison started out like most love stories, messy and magical. We met at a mutual friend's cookout. She had this laugh, this wild, unfiltered sound that made everyone turn their heads. I was drawn to her instantly. She was passionate, fiery, a woman who didn't just dream. She demanded her dreams come true. We built a life together, first in a cramped studio apartment, then a townhouse, then finally a modest home in the suburbs when Lily was born. But somewhere along the way, we stopped looking at each other. Not in anger, not even in disappointment, but in quiet, distant indifference. The kind that grows like mold in the corners of your life until everything smells faintly of decay. We were busy. I had meetings, flights, endless deadlines. She had Lily, the house, her job as a school counselor. We passed like ships in the night, polite, tired, and too afraid to ask the hard questions. Then came the mistake. There was a woman at work. Her name doesn't matter now. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust, not in the romantic sense. It was loneliness, ego, and a deep, aching hunger to feel seen. It was one night, one decision, and it destroyed everything. When Allison found out, she didn't scream. She didn't throw things or demand explanations. She just stood there in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee she never drank, staring at me like I was a stranger who had broken into her home. The silence between us was louder than any argument could have been. I moved out 2 days later. I thought I could fix it. I offered therapy, begged for forgiveness, promised to change, but something in her had closed. Maybe it had been closing for years, and I just never noticed. Maybe my mistake was simply the final nail in a coffin we had both built in silence. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment downtown. It had a view of the river and a doorman who always smiled too much. It was modern, clean, and utterly soulless. I filled the place with expensive furniture and cheap whiskey. On nights when I had Lily, I tried to pretend I was okay. I made pancakes, read bedtime stories, learned how to braid her hair. But she knew. Kids always know. They can smell sorrow the way dogs smell fear. After the divorce, I started waking up at 3 a.m. every night. No matter how tired I was, my body would jolt awake, heart racing, breath shallow. I'd sit in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had become the man I never wanted to be. I stopped going to work as much. I'd show up late, leave early, cancel meetings. My performance slipped, so did my health. I stopped exercising, ate whatever was easy, drank too much. Friends stopped calling. I didn't blame them. I wasn't fun to be around. I had nothing to offer but regret and empty stories about what life used to be. It was around that time I stopped believing in anything, not just in God, but in people, in myself, in the idea that things could ever get better. I wasn't angry. I was just numb, like someone had turned down the volume on my soul. I still went through the motions. I still paid bills, showed up for visitation weekends, responded to emails, but inside, I was fading, quietly, slowly. Like smoke drifting from a candle no one noticed had gone out. Then one afternoon in late fall, I went to pick up Lily from Allison's. She had forgotten her backpack, so I walked into the foyer to get it. As I bent down, something caught my eye, an old photo frame tucked on a side table. It was a picture of us, not the broken us, but the beginning, our wedding day. She was laughing, throwing her head back, flowers in her hair. I was staring at her like she was the only light in the world. That image hit me like a freight train. I left in a hurry, telling Allison I had a meeting. I didn't. I just drove. No direction, no plan. The leaves were turning gold and red, the sky soft with October clouds. Somewhere around the outskirts of town, I pulled over near a small, quiet church I used to pass every day but never noticed. It was old, brick, the kind with a little white steeple and an open door. I don't know what made me go inside. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the whisper of something I couldn't name. The sanctuary was empty, dimly lit by stained glass windows that turned the sunlight into ribbons of color. I sat in the last pew, the way I used to when I was a kid, legs now long enough to touch the floor, but heart just as lost. And for the first time in years, I prayed. It wasn't a beautiful prayer. There were no elegant words, no scriptures, no certainty. Just a broken man mumbling into the silence. I don't know if you're still there, but if you are, I need help. I can't keep doing this. I don't know who I am anymore. No answer came. No thunder, no divine light, no warmth in my chest, just silence. But for some reason, I didn't feel alone. I left that church different, not fixed, not whole, but cracked open, just enough to let something in. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks, and the next morning, I found myself whispering a sentence I hadn't said in years. God, please show me the way. When you lose everything, the world gets quiet. Not peaceful quiet. No, more like the kind of silence that hums with guilt, with shame, with the echo of mistakes you can't outrun. It's a silence that wraps itself around your bones and follows you through every hour of the day. That was my reality when I left everything behind. My wife, my daughter, my job, my sense of direction. I had become the kind of man I used to pity. Untethered, adrift, surviving rather than living. I ended up in a cheap long-stay motel on the outskirts of Seattle. The sort of place that didn't care why you were there, only that you paid in cash. The hallway smelled like stale cigarettes and damp carpet. My room had a bed with springs that dug into my back, a flickering ceiling light, and a tiny window that barely let in the gray Pacific Northwest sun. It wasn't a home, but I didn't deserve one. The first week, I didn't talk to anyone. I moved like a ghost through the hallways, taking my meals in silence, avoiding eye contact. I'd lost the habit of conversation. I spent my days working in a warehouse 2 towns over, unloading trucks and stacking boxes. My hands blistered, my back ached, and I barely made enough to pay rent and eat. Nights were worse. The silence turned louder then, memories creeping in like unwelcome guests. The sound of my daughter's laugh, the way my wife used to hum while folding laundry, the last fight, the look in her eyes as I walked out the door. Then came Joe. He was already living in the room next to mine when I arrived. An older man, late 60s, maybe early 70s, wiry frame, deep wrinkles etched into a face that had clearly seen too much sun and too much life. He had a raspy voice and coughed often, a smoker's cough that rattled his ribs. We crossed paths in the shared kitchen one evening. He nodded. I nodded. That was it. But the next night, he knocked on my door with 2 chipped mugs and a jar of instant coffee. "Figured you might want company," he said simply. I didn't. Not really. But I couldn't bring myself to turn him away. So I stepped aside, and he sat on the edge of the bed like it was the most natural thing in the world. He talked while I listened. At first, I thought he was just another old-timer with too many stories and too much time. But there was something different about Joe. His stories had weight, not just words. He talked about serving in Vietnam, about losing his brother to cancer, about a woman he loved once but couldn't hold on to. He didn't hide his scars. He wore them like badges. "What about you?" he asked after a while. I hesitated. Not much to tell. He looked at me like he didn't believe that for a second, but didn't press. "We all got something. You'll talk when you're ready." I wasn't ready, but I didn't stop him from coming back the next night, or the one after that. It became a ritual: coffee, conversation, silence. Joe had this calming presence. He didn't judge, didn't push. Sometimes he'd quote from the Bible, not in a preachy way, but like it was part of his language. One night he said, "You ever think God lets us fall so we'll finally look up?" I shrugged. I stopped believing in God a long time ago. He didn't flinch, just nodded, like he'd heard it before. He didn't stop believing in you. That stuck with me longer than I wanted to admit. Joe told me he'd been sober for 15 years. Said he used to be a mean drunk, the kind of guy who broke things and didn't say sorry. He got clean after waking up in a ditch, bleeding from the head, not remembering how he got there. He said that was his moment, the one where he realized he couldn't keep living the way he was. Mine hadn't come yet. Or maybe it had, and I just hadn't recognized it. A few weeks after I met him, Joe handed me a book. "It's a Bible," he said. "Not trying to convert you, just thought you might find something in there." I took it, mostly out of politeness. The cover was worn, the pages dog-eared. He'd underlined verses, scribbled notes in the margins. I didn't open it that night, just left it on the nightstand like a souvenir from a place I hadn't visited. But the next day, something made me pick it up. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way Joe had looked at me, like he saw something in me I didn't. I opened it at random, landed on John 1:5. "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." It didn't mean anything to me. Not yet. But it felt like someone had written it for people like me, people stuck in the dark, hoping there was still something worth reaching for. I didn't talk to Joe about it, not right away, but I started listening more when he spoke about faith. He told me God wasn't just for church folks or the ones who had it all together. He said grace was for the broken, especially the broken. "Think about Peter," he said one night. "Denied Jesus 3 times, still got chosen to lead. If that don't tell you something about redemption, I don't know what does." I didn't know who Peter was, but I nodded anyway. Joe's health started to decline after that. The coughing got worse. He lost weight. Some nights he didn't come out at all. I knocked a few times. He said he was fine. I knew he was lying. One night I brought the coffee. He smiled when he opened the door. "Didn't think you'd come. You always say it's better to talk than to sit in your own head." He laughed weakly. "You listen more than you let on." He didn't drink much of the coffee that night, just held the mug and stared at the wall. "I don't have much time left," he said. "The docs told me last year. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't know what to say. I felt something in my chest twist." "You scared?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "I used to be, but I made peace with it. I've done my share of wrong, but I also found grace. I know where I'm going." I swallowed hard. I wish I could say the same. "You can," he said, looking at me with tired but steady eyes. "It ain't too late. It's never too late." The next morning, I found his door open. He was lying on the bed, peaceful, like he'd just drifted off. The Bible was open on his chest, One hand rested on the page. The coroner said it was his heart, said it was a matter of time. I didn't go to work that day. I just sat on the steps outside our rooms, holding the chipped mug he used to drink from. I cried. Not just for Joe, but for everything. For the years I wasted, for the people I hurt, for the man I'd become. After the funeral, which was quiet, just a few people from the building and an old vet friend, I took the Bible back with me. I started reading it more, not cover to cover, just pieces. Psalms, John, Romans. I didn't understand all of it, but something in it began to soften me. I found myself thinking about Joe's words, about grace, about second chances, about light in the darkness. I started writing letters to my daughter. I never sent them, just wrote them, page after page. I apologized. I told her about the man I used to be and the one I was trying to become. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes blurred. One night I knelt by the side of the bed, not because I knew what I was doing, but because I didn't know what else to do. God, I whispered, I don't know if you're real, but if you are, help me, please. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't holy. It was desperate. But I think that's what prayer really is. The next morning didn't feel magical. The pain didn't disappear, but something felt different. Like I wasn't alone anymore. Like maybe, just maybe, I was being heard. Over time, I found a local church. Small, nothing fancy, just regular people trying to hold each other up. They didn't care about my past. They welcomed me like I was already family. I started volunteering, cleaning, stacking chairs, helping out with food drives. It felt good to be useful again. To belong. I even reached out to my daughter's mother. We talked. It was awkward, painful, but she listened. I asked if I could write to our daughter, not to explain, just to let her know I was thinking of her. She said yes. The first letter I sent was simple. I'm sorry. I love you. I hope one day you'll let me show you who I'm becoming. A week later, I got a reply. Just one sentence. I'm not ready yet, but I read your letter. That was enough. I wasn't healed. Not completely. Maybe I never would be. But I was on the path, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking it alone. The rain had started suddenly that afternoon, thick and cold, like it had a purpose. Ethan didn't usually walk down Fremont Street, but he had no place else to go. His apartment felt like a prison cell, and the coffee shop he often escaped to had closed early for renovations. So he wandered, letting the drizzle soak through his jacket, until he saw a small building tucked between a laundromat and an abandoned bookstore, a church he hadn't noticed before. The front door was open. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe something deeper he couldn't name, but he stepped inside. The scent of old wood and faint incense greeted him. The space was dim but warm, with rows of worn pews and tall stained glass windows that painted fractured rainbows on the stone floor. There were maybe 10 people scattered across the benches. No one looked at him. No one asked questions. He sat in the back trying to be invisible, still dripping. His fingers trembled slightly. He told himself it was from the cold. At the front stood a man, simple in dress, no pulpit or stage, just a gentle posture and eyes that didn't seem to look through people, but into them. This was David, though Ethan wouldn't learn his name until later. David wasn't like the preachers Ethan had seen on TV. Loud, theatrical, polished. He spoke softly, almost as if he were talking to a friend, not a crowd. His voice was rough but kind, like a rope worn from use but strong enough to hold weight. And as he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't thunder about sin or judgment. Instead, he read from the book of Psalms, about valleys of shadow and not being afraid. Ethan didn't know what to make of it. He wasn't sure why he didn't leave. He just sat there, feeling nothing and everything all at once. The words floated around him like a language he used to know but had forgotten. They didn't make sense, but they didn't push him away either. That was new. He left before the service ended, slipping out into the rain again, unsure of what had just happened. But something about that place lingered. It followed him back to his apartment. It echoed in the silence between the ticking of his kitchen clock and the hum of the refrigerator. He tried to shake it off. He turned on the TV, scrolled mindlessly through his phone, stared at the ceiling in the dark. but something had been stirred. The next week, he found himself back on Fremont Street. This time, it wasn't raining, and he had no excuse. He stood across the street from the church for a long time, pretending to check his phone, pretending he was just passing by. Eventually, he went in. No one acknowledged him again. He liked that. He didn't want attention. He just wanted something. He wasn't sure what. David was speaking again, this time from the book of John. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you." Ethan almost laughed under his breath. Peace. What a foreign concept. His life was anything but peaceful. He was living in the aftermath of bad choices, a failed marriage, broken relationships, self-loathing he wore like a second skin. But he stayed. He didn't listen with his mind, not yet, but his body did. His presence was a kind of surrender. Weeks passed, he kept going, always sitting in the back, always leaving early. He never spoke to anyone. David never called him out. No one handed him pamphlets or asked for his story. And so Ethan kept coming back. He didn't believe in anything yet. Not in God, not in grace, and definitely not in himself. But there was something calming about the stillness in that room, something different from the noise of the world outside. He started to notice details. The elderly woman in the third row who always wore a red shawl. The young couple who held hands throughout the service. The way David always lingered a few seconds longer on certain words, like he knew someone in the room needed them. Maybe that someone was Ethan. And then came that Sunday. It was sunnier than usual. The light spilled through the windows more boldly, casting gold over the wooden floor. Ethan arrived early for the first time. He sat in the same seat, but this time he felt expectant, like the air was charged. David walked up front and paused longer than usual before speaking. He opened his Bible and read, "Then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, 'I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life.'" John 8:12. It hit Ethan like a whisper in his bones. He had heard verses before, growing up in a house where religion was used more as discipline than comfort. He'd heard people use the name of Jesus like a hammer. But this verse wasn't a weapon, it was a lifeline, and for some reason, it felt personal. He didn't even realize he was crying until a tear hit the back of his hand. The dam broke without warning. His shoulders began to shake, and he bowed his head, ashamed of being seen but too broken to hold it in. It wasn't a loud cry, it was quiet, tremulous, like the sound of a heart cracking open after being sealed for years. The room didn't change. No one stared. David kept reading, but in Ethan's chest something shifted, a crack of light in years of darkness. He didn't fully understand what was happening. He couldn't explain why that one sentence unraveled him. Maybe it was the words. Maybe it was the way David said them. Maybe it was the months of silent sitting, building toward this moment. Whatever it was, Ethan knew one thing. He was not alone anymore. Not in that moment. Not in that room. Not in his pain. Later that day, as he walked home, the world felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but clearer. The rain clouds had lifted, literally and metaphorically. He thought about the verse again and again. "Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness." It was almost laughable. He'd been in darkness for so long, he wasn't sure how to move any other way. But now a new thought began to form. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way. He didn't tell anyone about the moment he had. He wouldn't have known how to put it into words. But something changed. He returned to the church, and this time, when David smiled in his direction after the service, Ethan didn't look away. He nodded. It was small, but it was a beginning. Forgiving others was hard, sure, but forgiving himself, that was the mountain Ethan couldn't climb. Every time he thought he might be ready to move forward, the memories would drag him back like an undertow. Moments he'd rather forget, things he said and did that he couldn't take back. Regret was a cruel companion. It didn't shout, it whispered. It sat beside him in silence and rewound the tape of his failures on an endless loop. It had been 3 weeks since that Sunday, the one where he broke down in the back pew, undone by a single verse. Since then, he'd gone to church every weekend, always sitting in the same seat, always arriving early now. Something inside him had shifted. He still wasn't sure what he believed exactly, but he knew he couldn't go back to the man he was. That door had closed. It was David who gently invited him to the Wednesday night group. Just a few people sharing stories. No pressure to speak. You can just listen, if that's what you need. Ethan had nodded, not making any promises, but curiosity stirred. And if he was honest with himself, he was tired of walking through the valley alone. That first Wednesday, he showed up 5 minutes late, his nerves jangling. The room was nothing like he expected. No folding chairs in a circle, no spotlight, just a small room off the side of the chapel, soft lighting, coffee in the corner, and a few people chatting quietly. They didn't look like saints. They looked like him, tired, human, worn around the edges. David welcomed him with a warm smile, no fanfare, just a nod that said, "You're here. That's enough." Ethan sat near the back again, a habit he hadn't yet broken. The first person who spoke that night was a woman named Maria. She had eyes that held stories, and a voice roughened by time and pain, but steady. She talked about waking up in a hospital hallway after an overdose. She talked about losing custody of her son. She talked about the day she knelt in a shelter, broke and empty, and whispered a prayer she didn't believe would be heard. "I wasn't trying to find God," she said, her hands folded in her lap. "I was trying not to die, but somehow he found me." Her words landed somewhere deep in Ethan's chest, not because he'd lived her story, but because he knew what it meant to be that far gone, to feel like you were beyond rescue. After the meeting, she approached him. "You're new," he nodded. "I'm glad you came. Sometimes sitting in a room like this is harder than rock bottom." He managed a small smile. "I don't even know why I came." "You don't have to," she replied. "Sometimes our feet get there before our hearts catch up." That became the start of something. Ethan kept showing up on Wednesdays. At first, he said nothing. He listened to people who wore their scars like badges of survival, listened to stories of loss, addiction, betrayal, and, somehow, redemption. There was no preaching, no demands, just honesty, raw and unrehearsed. And slowly, Ethan began to exhale. One night, weeks later, David looked at him after the group and said, "You don't have to carry it all alone, Ethan. The shame, the guilt, it'll crush you if you try." Ethan looked down. "Some weights you don't just drop, you live with them." Or, David said gently, "You put them down at the feet of someone stronger." He didn't reply, but the words stayed. It wasn't until his 5th or 6th meeting that Ethan spoke. His voice came out quiet, almost reluctant, like he was afraid it might betray him. "I wasn't a good husband," he started. "I mean, I wasn't violent. I didn't cheat, but I was absent, angry, unforgiving. I held on to resentment like it owed me something." The room was silent, not awkward, sacred. "My daughter, she used to call me her hero. Then one day, she stopped calling me anything at all." He stopped, blinking hard. The tears didn't fall, but they trembled at the edge. "I told myself it was all my ex-wife's fault, that she poisoned our daughter against me. But the truth is, I gave them every reason to leave. I was too proud to change, too afraid to ask for help, and now I don't even know if they remember me or want to." Maria reached over and placed her hand gently on his. No words, just presence. That night, when he left the church, he cried in the car. Not a violent storm, but a slow, steady weep, like the first rain after a drought. He didn't know what healing looked like, but he thought, maybe this was the beginning. The following weeks, Ethan spoke more, shared more. Not all at once. Grief didn't work that way. But little by little, the wounds that had festered in darkness began to breathe. He told them about the night his wife left, how he didn't stop her, how silence had filled their home long before she packed her bags. He confessed the bitterness he carried like armor. The nights he drank alone, not to get drunk, but to get numb. And for the first time, no one turned away. No one said, "You should have known better." They just listened. And that was its own kind of grace. Then came the letter. It arrived one Tuesday, a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper, covered in the handwriting he hadn't seen in years. "Hi, Dad. I don't know if this will reach you. I asked Mom if I could write, and she said she'd send it if I really wanted to. I don't know if you want to hear from me, but I miss you. I miss who you used to be when I was little. I remember when we used to walk to the lake and count the stars. I remember how you used to read me the same book 3 times just because I asked. I don't understand everything that happened, and maybe I don't need to. But I hope you're okay. I hope you're better now. I hope, maybe, we can talk someday. I think about you. More than you think. Love, Ellie. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed for hours, reading and rereading the letter. His hands trembled. The tears came quietly, reverently. It felt like something sacred had entered the room. He didn't know what this meant. He didn't know if Ellie forgave him. But the fact that she remembered, that she reached out, it felt like the sky had cracked open just enough to let light in. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into his wallet. He carried it everywhere, not as proof of redemption, but as a fragile thread of hope, a thread he was desperate to follow. The next night at group, he brought the letter. He didn't read it out loud. He just held it up. "She wrote me," he said, voice thick with awe. "My daughter, after all this time." Maria smiled, eyes glistening. "That's the thing about grace," she said. "It doesn't wait until you're ready. It just shows up." David leaned forward. "You think maybe that door you thought was locked was just waiting for you to knock again?" Ethan nodded slowly, eyes brimming. I think God left it cracked open the whole time." That night, walking home beneath a clear sky, Ethan looked up. The stars seemed brighter somehow. Maybe they'd always been that bright. Maybe he just hadn't looked up in years. He knew there was still a long road ahead, apologies to make, trust to rebuild, steps to take with trembling legs, but for the first time, he believed it was possible. "I'm starting to believe," he whispered into the night, "that maybe God didn't give up on me after all." And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking alone. Wanted to pef. The first time I walked through the doors of the church kitchen, it didn't feel like light. It felt like noise. Pots clanging, voices layered over each other, the faint hiss of steam, and the scent of something warm, salty, and faintly familiar. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, white and harsh, but they did little to chase away the feeling that I didn't belong there. I had signed up to volunteer at the church's community kitchen, but deep down I was still hiding. Hiding from what I had done, from who I had become, from what others might see in me if they looked too closely. It's strange. When you lose everything, you'd think there's nothing left to hide. But shame doesn't follow logic. It clings, even when you have nothing left. "Hey there, first time?" The voice came from a woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her apron was stained with tomato sauce, and she held a ladle like it was a conductor's baton. "Yeah," I said, my voice dry. "Ethan." "Carol," she said, and stuck out her hand with a firm shake. "You stir, chop, or scrub?" I hesitated, unsure of what she meant. She grinned. "You don't have to choose yet. You'll get to do all 3. And just like that, she put me to work. The first hour, I scrubbed dried beans off a steel pot the size of a barrel. The next, I was chopping celery with a dull knife that made my wrist ache. Then I was at the serving window, scooping pasta into styrofoam trays as a line of guests shuffled forward, eyes tired, hands rough, voices low with gratitude or exhaustion, or both. I didn't talk much that first day. I kept my head down, focused on the work. But Carol was the opposite. She seemed to float between stations, teasing the other volunteers, making jokes with the guests, dropping little bits of wisdom without sounding like she meant to. I overheard her tell a younger girl, "Serving isn't about being needed, it's about being present." I didn't know what she meant at the time. I was still trying not to be seen. The weeks passed, and I kept coming back, not because I suddenly felt noble or redeemed, but because I had nowhere else to be. Because I eel something again, even if it was just tired feet and the comfort of hot dishwater. Carol started letting me in on more of the routine. She trusted me with the bread donations, the leftovers count, even the keys to open early some days. "You're reliable," she told me one afternoon over the roar of the dish sanitizer. Not everyone is. I almost laughed. Reliable? I had let down everyone I'd ever loved. I had stood in the rubble of my marriage, my business, my friendships, but I just nodded because I didn't know how to explain the weight I carried, the way even kindness felt like a debt I couldn't repay. One rainy evening, just before closing, a young boy stumbled into the kitchen. He couldn't have been more than 13, skinny, clothes 2 sizes too big, eyes wide with something wild and far away. He didn't speak. He just collapsed into the arms of a volunteer, his body trembling like a snapped wire. I was closest. I dropped the bin I was carrying and ran to them. "He's burning up," someone said. Carol knelt beside him and touched his neck. "Overdose," she said quickly, grim. "Narcan?" We didn't have any. Without thinking, I scooped the boy up. He was light, boneless, like a rag soaked in sweat. "I'll drive," I said, already heading toward the door. Carol followed, barking instructions to call the clinic down the street. My heart was pounding, not just from fear for the boy, but from something else I couldn't name. Purpose, maybe. Urgency that wasn't about me for once. At the clinic, the nurses took him from my arms, and I stood by the wall, watching through the window as they worked on him. I didn't even know his name. I sat there until they told me he'd live. Just like that, he'd live. I walked back to the church kitchen in the dark. The streets were slick with rain. The air smelled of wet pavement and damp leaves. I couldn't stop shaking, not from cold, but from everything inside me that had cracked open. Carol was waiting for me with a cup of lukewarm coffee. She didn't say much, just "You did good." I looked at her and the tears came before I could stop them. They weren't loud or dramatic, just quiet, hot streams down my face. I hadn't cried in years. I hadn't thought I deserved to. "You saved him," I whispered. Carol shook her head. "No, you showed up. That's what matters." It was such a simple thing, but it hit me like thunder. I started seeing the work differently after that. I noticed how Carol remembered every guest's name, how she always saved an extra slice of cake for Miss Teresa, who'd lost her husband last winter, how she sat down next to a man with dementia and let him tell the same story 3 times, how she prayed, not loudly, not for show, but quietly, over the soup pot, as if stirring grace into the broth. And I started talking, to the guests, to the volunteers, to Carol. I told her about my past, not all at once, but in pieces, about the divorce, the financial mess, the years of silence between me and my brother, about how I still sometimes woke up at 3 a.m. convinced I was worthless. She never looked at me with pity, only with clarity. "You're not here to prove anything," she said once. "You're here because you're loved." It didn't feel true yet, but I wanted it to be. There was one man, James, who came in every Friday with a limp and a harmonica. He always sat by the window, played old gospel songs after his meal. One day he handed me the harmonica. "Try it," he said. I laughed. "I don't know how." "Doesn't matter," he said. "Just breathe through it." I put it to my lips and blew. A single wavering note came out, off-key but real. James nodded. "That's how it starts." I thought about that for days, about how healing wasn't a switch. It was a series of off-key notes, of attempts, of breathing through what you didn't yet understand. One night, after we'd closed up, Carol invited me to stay for evening prayer. Just a few of us, sitting in a circle in the sanctuary. I wasn't sure I belonged there, but she handed me a candle. "Light it if you want," she said, "for whatever you're carrying." I held the unlit candle in my hand for a long time, and then I lit it. I didn't say anything, but in my heart I whispered, "Let there be light." The days blurred into each other. I kept volunteering. I kept showing up. And one afternoon, weeks later, the boy I had carried in came back. Clean shirt, clear eyes. He approached me while I was wiping down the tables. "You're the guy who took me to the clinic." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He looked down, then up again. "Thank you," he said. That was all. But it was enough. More than enough. Later, walking home, I thought about that moment. About how light doesn't crash in like fireworks. It creeps in, like sunrise through blinds, like breath, like a candle passed from one hand to another. I had spent so long waiting for something big to change me. But the change had come slowly, in soapsuds and conversations, in the feel of warm bread passed across a counter and the ache of feet well used. That night, as I lay in bed, I whispered to myself, the light didn't just guide me, it went through me. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The letter had been sitting on his desk for 3 days before Ethan found the courage to seal it. It wasn't a letter meant to rekindle old love or plead for a second chance. This wasn't about returning to what was lost. It was about facing what he had broken. For months, he had rehearsed the words in his head, night after night, but writing them down had felt like putting his soul on trial. Still, it was time. There was a strange kind of peace in surrender, in admitting to someone else the truth you finally accepted for yourself. He had written to Jenna not because he expected her forgiveness, but because he needed to offer it to her, and to himself. The act of writing wasn't about her reading it. It was about being able to finally say, I was wrong, and mean it with every fiber of his being. He started with her name. Just her name. Jenna. He stared at it for 10 minutes before he could write another word. It felt like opening a door to a room he had once lived in, but hadn't visited in years. The rest of the letter spilled slowly, honestly, painfully, about the way he had abandoned his responsibilities, how he had justified absence as busyness, and worst of all, how he had made her carry the emotional weight of a collapsing marriage alone. He wrote about the birthday party he missed. Their son had turned 7 that year. Jenna had called him 3 times, just to check if he'd be there. Each time he had lied. I'm leaving the office now. Just stuck in traffic. Be there in 5. But he never showed up. Instead, he had sat in his car 2 blocks away, paralyzed by guilt and the fear of facing the people he had disappointed. The sound of children's laughter from the party carried down the street. He remembered gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, then driving away without ever stepping out. Ethan folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and wrote her name again, softer this time, as though the ink itself could convey the humility in his heart. He mailed it without expectation. The days that followed were heavy with silence. No calls, no texts, just the echo of everything he'd written and the fear that it might have reopened wounds that had never healed. But something inside him had shifted. There was a stillness where shame used to live. It wasn't peace, not quite, but it was the beginning of something like it. He found himself walking more, praying more, revisiting old memories not to wallow in them, but to understand. Sometimes he sat at the park bench near the school where his son studied and watched other parents pick up their children, wondering if one day he'd have the right to stand among them again. He carried a pocket-sized Bible now, something he hadn't touched in years. One verse kept ringing in his ears, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." It became his daily plea. On the 5th day, his phone rang. It was a number he hadn't saved, but he knew who it was the second he saw it. "Hello?" There was a pause. Then, Ethan. Her voice hadn't changed. There was that same steadiness, the kind that once comforted him in their early years, but now it held something sharper, boundaries forged by pain. "I got your letter," she said. He wanted to respond, to thank her for reading it, but he stayed silent. "It surprised me, not because of what you wrote, but because you finally said it." "I meant every word," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. Another pause. "I'm not calling because I want to talk about the past. We've done enough of that in silence. I'm calling because Caleb asked if you were ever going to come see him again." His throat tightened. He hadn't heard his son's name spoken aloud in months. "I don't know what to tell him," she continued, "but I also don't want to tell him no." "Can I see him?" he asked, trying not to sound too desperate, too hopeful. She was quiet for a long moment. "You can see him this weekend, Saturday, after school. I'll wait with him outside the gate. He doesn't know you're coming, and I'd like to keep it that way in case you don't show." "I'll be there," Ethan said immediately. She didn't respond to that, just said 4 o'clock and hung up. He stood in place for a long time, phone still to his ear even after the call ended. There was no warmth in her voice, no forgiveness, but there was a door, barely ajar, and that was more than he had hoped for. Saturday arrived like a slow tide. Ethan had barely slept. He'd chosen his clothes carefully, not to impress, but to appear calm, stable, changed. In one hand he held a small bouquet of yellow tulips, Jenna's favorite, though he didn't know if she'd accept them. In the other his Bible, pages marked with prayers he had clung to during the darkest nights. He arrived early and stood across the street from the school gate. The playground was quiet. Parents started to gather. He saw her before she saw him, Jenna, in a simple coat, hair tied back. She held Caleb's hand. Their son was taller now, more mature. Ethan's heart ached at the realization that he had missed so many milestones. The first lost tooth, first soccer game, first time riding a bike. When she finally saw him, her expression didn't soften. She simply nodded once and whispered something to Caleb. The boy turned, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Ethan. For a second, nothing happened. Then his face lit up, not with the uninhibited joy Ethan had once known, but with a cautious curiosity. He didn't run. He walked slowly, Jenna releasing his hand. Ethan knelt down, setting the flowers beside him, holding out the Bible as if it were a peace offering. "Hi, Caleb," he said, voice shaking. The boy stood a few feet away, watching him. "Are you really my dad?" he asked softly. "I am," Ethan replied, blinking back tears. "And I'm really sorry I haven't been around. That was my fault. But I'm here now, and I'd like to be here more, if that's okay." Caleb looked down at the flowers, then back at the Bible. "Do you believe in God?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I do. I didn't used to, not really, but I asked him for another chance, not just with him, with you." Caleb took a step forward. "Mom says people can change if they want to." "She's right," Ethan said. There was a long pause. Then Caleb reached out and touched the edge of the Bible. "Do you read stories from this?" "Every day," Ethan answered. "Will you read one to me now?" Ethan looked up at Jenna. She didn't smile, but she didn't stop him either. He opened the book to the story of the prodigal son and began to read, his voice trembling at first, then stronger as his son leaned closer. The sun began to dip low behind the school building, casting golden light over the playground. And as Ethan read, he realized he wasn't just telling his son a story, he was telling him their story. One of mistakes, return, and the hope that love, in its truest form, never fully dies. It waits. Later, as they sat side by side on the bench outside the school, Caleb resting his head against Ethan's shoulder, he looked at his son and whispered, "I thought I'd lost you forever." Caleb shrugged gently. "You came back." And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he wasn't just forgiven, he was found. It started with a letter and a question I hadn't expected. "Would you be willing to share your testimony at the Easter service?" It was signed by Pastor David, the man who had first greeted me months ago with a handshake that didn't flinch and eyes that didn't judge. I must have read that letter a dozen times, maybe more. Each time, I felt my chest tighten a little, as if the paper itself carried a weight I wasn't ready to lift. For days, I kept the letter folded in my pocket, smoothing the creases with nervous fingers, trying to convince myself I could ignore it. I had no business standing up there, telling people anything about God, let alone my own story. Who was I to speak? A man who had ruined his marriage, abandoned his son, crawled through addiction and despair like a man chasing his own shadow. What could I say that wouldn't sound like a plea for pity or worse? A performance. And yet something in me stirred. The first time I walked into the church basement to volunteer at the soup kitchen, I didn't know I was stepping into a place that would slowly become holy ground. That was months ago. Since then, I'd scrubbed dishes, handed out hot meals, and listened to men and women with stories more broken than mine. It wasn't redemption in a grand cinematic way. It was quiet and gritty, and sometimes hard to distinguish from just doing the next right thing. But somewhere in those hours, between the folding chairs and Carol's worn voice humming hymns while she chopped onions, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, grace wasn't for the perfect. Maybe it was for people like me. So I said yes. What followed was an agonizing, exhilarating week of writing and rewriting. I'd sit at the desk in the corner of my apartment, what used to be my son's room, and try to make sense of everything. I filled pages with confessions, prayers, doubts, memories. I started with safe words, rehearsed phrases I thought people wanted to hear. But the more I wrote, the more I hated what I read. It wasn't me. It was a cleaned-up version of a life I had lived in the mud. One night, I stared at the blank page and said aloud, "God, if you want me to do this, you're going to have to help me tell the truth." And the words came. Not all at once, but enough to start. Enough to believe I didn't have to impress anyone. I only had to be honest. Easter morning arrived with golden light streaming through my window. I stood in front of my closet and debated for 10 minutes about what to wear. In the end, I put on the shirt Jenna had given me on our last anniversary. It still fit, though the years had tried to shrink it. I tucked a folded copy of my testimony in the inside pocket of my coat and slipped a small cross around my neck, the one my mother had given me when I was a teenager. I hadn't worn it in years. The church was already buzzing when I arrived. Children in pastel dresses and clip-on ties chased each other through the aisles, while older couples greeted one another with hugs and whispered blessings. I found Pastor David in the side room, dressed in his usual navy blazer and calm demeanor. He clasped my shoulder and simply said, "You ready?" I nodded, even though I wasn't. But I think he knew that. I think God did too. When it was time, I walked up to the pulpit, my hands trembling ever so slightly. The sanctuary seemed impossibly large from up there, even though I'd sat in the back pew for weeks. I looked out over the rows of faces, some familiar, some not, and took a slow breath. For a second, I wanted to run. But then I thought of my son. I thought of the soup kitchen. I thought of Carol's humming, Pastor David's letter, and the way Grace had found me not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet persistence of love. So I began. My name is Ethan, and for most of my life, I've lived like I was beyond saving. I told them about the night I left home, the years I spent chasing false gods, money, alcohol, pride. I told them how I lied to my wife, missed birthdays, broke promises. I told them about the morning I woke up in a shelter with nothing but the clothes on my back and a note from a stranger that read, "There's still time to come home." I told them how I didn't believe in God anymore and how God didn't seem to care. But he did, I said. He cared enough to wait for me. I spoke of the slow return, not the dramatic conversion people might expect, but the aching, tentative journey back to faith. I shared how scrubbing pots and cleaning toilets at the church kitchen became a kind of prayer. How a woman named Carol taught me that humility isn't weakness, it's the birthplace of strength. How a child once handed me a paper heart that said, "Jesus loves you," and I almost cried because I didn't think anyone did. And then I said the thing I'd written and erased at least 20 times. I used to think faith was something you had to cling to, something you earned by being good enough, clean enough, strong enough. But I was none of those things. What I've learned is that faith isn't what you hold, it's what holds you. I was held when I least deserved it. I was carried when I couldn't walk. And I believe truly that Jesus didn't just save me, he stayed with me. I paused, afraid of how it would land. But the silence was sacred, not awkward. I was in the darkest place of my life, I said, and Christ found me there, not to shame me, not to scold me, but to lead me out. That's what Easter means to me. Not just resurrection 2,000 years ago, but resurrection today, in me, in anyone who dares to believe again. I closed my notes and stepped back. For a second, I heard nothing. Then a sound began, soft clapping, then louder. People stood, faces blurred by tears. An older man near the front wiped his eyes and walked toward me. He reached out and shook my hand, gripping it tight. "That," he said, voice trembling, "was my story too. I just never had the courage to tell it." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Another man approached, and then a woman. One by one, strangers became family. It wasn't the applause that moved me. It was the recognition in their eyes, the way brokenness mirrored brokenness, and somehow, in that reflection, healing began. Pastor David hugged me in the hallway afterward. You didn't just tell your story, he said. You preached a resurrection. That afternoon, I sat in the courtyard outside the church, the sun warming my face. Children laughed nearby, chasing bubbles and Easter eggs. I watched them and thought about how I used to run, from myself, from truth, from God. But now, I wasn't running anymore. I was rooted. I thought about Jenna, about our son, about the long road still ahead. Reconciliation isn't a switch you flip. It's a door you knock on, again and again. But today the door was open, and so was my heart. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the pictures Jenna had sent of our boy last weekend. His smile, his eyes, the way he held the toy I sent. There was still hope. And I whispered a prayer, not grand, not poetic, just real. Thank you. Later that week, I found a message waiting for me at the church office. It was from a man named Thomas. He said he'd sat in the third row that Easter morning and hadn't been in church in 10 years. Said he didn't know why he came, but now he knew. If God can reach you, he wrote, maybe he hasn't given up on me. That's when I understood something profound. This wasn't just about me. My healing wasn't mine alone. It was a ripple, touching others I couldn't see. My pain redeemed became a vessel. My voice, once silenced by shame, now carried a song of hope. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I didn't just find my way back. I found family, in places I never expected. I found faith, not as a trophy, but as a lifeline. And I found the church, not as a building, but as a people who saw me, heard me, and stayed. That's resurrection. That's grace. That's why I keep showing up, because somewhere, someone else is still in the dark, waiting for the light. And if my story can be a spark, then let it burn bright. The afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden hue, its warm light filtering through the trees like a gentle whisper from heaven. Ethan strolled slowly, hand in hand with his daughter, the rhythm of their steps syncing with the soft rustle of leaves above them. It had become their tradition, Sunday afternoons in the park. For Ethan, these moments were more than routine. They were sacred. They were proof that grace could mend even the most broken stories. His daughter, now 8 years old, had grown into a curious and thoughtful child. She looked up at him with eyes so full of questions it almost startled him. In her other hand, she held his small leather Bible, the one he carried everywhere, the one he had once clutched in desperation and now held in gratitude. "Daddy," she asked, tilting her head slightly, "do you think God really loves you? Even after everything?" The question landed like a soft thunder in his heart. She didn't mean it in judgment, she was too young for that, but in innocent wonder. He looked at her, her brown hair catching the light, her gaze open and sincere. He took a breath, letting the quiet of the moment cradle them. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady. "I believe he does, even after everything." "But how?" she asked, frowning gently. "You told me you made mistakes. You said you hurt people, and you left church for a long time." He nodded. "I did. I lost my way. I lost everything, but God didn't lose me." She blinked, trying to wrap her young mind around that. Ethan knelt in the grass so he could look at her eye to eye. He opened the Bible in her hands to a page worn soft by years of reading. "Let me tell you a story," he said, "one that helped me understand what love really looks like." She settled beside him, knees brushing the earth, as he began. "There was a blind man," Ethan said. "He sat by the road near the city of Jericho. He was poor, forgotten by most people. He couldn't see the road, but he could hear the crowd, and in that noise he heard that Jesus was passing by." "What did he do?" she asked, leaning in. "He shouted, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And when the people told him to be quiet, he shouted louder. He wouldn't stop. He believed Jesus could help him, even when others said he wasn't worth it." His daughter's eyes widened. Was Jesus mad that he shouted? "No," Ethan smiled. "Jesus stopped. In all the noise and the crowd, he heard that one voice, and he asked for the man to be brought to him. When the man came, Jesus asked him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the man said, 'Lord, I want to see.'" Ethan paused, letting the silence make space for the miracle. And Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Just like that, he could see, because he believed. His daughter sat still, letting the story soak in. Then she turned to him and whispered, "Do you think I could believe like that too?" Ethan's throat tightened. This was the moment he hadn't dared pray for, the moment he thought might come years later, if ever. He took her hand gently. "Belief starts in the heart," he said. "You don't have to be perfect or know everything. You just need to want to know God, to trust that He loves you and that He listens." She looked down at the Bible, then up at him. "Can we pray, like you do?" He nodded, and they bowed their heads right there in the grass, beneath the arms of old trees, and a sun that seemed to shine a little warmer just then. Ethan's voice trembled as he led the prayer, his heart cracked wide open by her sincerity. "God," he whispered, "thank you for loving us. Thank you for hearing us. I pray that my daughter will know you the way I do, that she'll feel your light even when life is hard, that she'll never forget that you see her, just like you saw that man at the gate." His daughter squeezed his hand and added, "Thank you for listening to me too. I want to know you more. I want to see." They sat in silence afterward, no rush to move, the stillness sacred. For Ethan, it was as if time folded gently in on itself. His past mistakes, his long years of wandering, the nights he wept alone, they all found their place in this one moment of redemption. The road that had once seemed so dark now glimmered with light, not because the path was easier, but because he no longer walked it alone. His daughter stood, brushing off her knees. "I feel happy," she said, "like something big is happening, but I can't see it yet." Ethan smiled, rising beside her. "That's how faith works," he said. "It starts inside, and then slowly, it changes everything." They walked on, and she held the Bible close to her chest. The sun had begun to dip lower, casting long shadows, but neither of them noticed. At the edge of the park they paused. Ethan looked up at the sky, the soft blues blending into gold. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," he said quietly, almost to himself. His daughter looked at him. "Why not?" He took a deep breath. "Because now I carry the light inside me." She slipped her hand into his once more, her small fingers wrapping around his with quiet trust. They turned toward home, father and daughter, two believers walking forward, not in perfection, but in faith. And as the trees whispered above and the sky turned to fire, Ethan knew something he hadn't always known, that light isn't the absence of darkness, it's the presence of love, of hope, of grace that refuses to let go. He smiled. "We're not in the dark anymore," he said. She nodded. "Because we're walking with Him." Ethan's heart was full. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had finally said yes to the one who did. And now with his daughter beside him and the road stretched ahead, he knew, no matter what came next, he wouldn't walk it alone. He had found the light. And more importantly, the light had found him. Maybe you're like I was, living a life that looks fine on the outside, but feels hollow on the inside. Maybe you've lost something, your faith, your way, your voice. Or maybe you're just waiting for someone to remind you that you're not too far gone, that it's not too late. I thought I had to fix everything to be loved again, but all it took was saying, "God, I'm tired. Help me." And you know what? He was there. Not with lightning or grand gestures, but in the small things, in my daughter's eyes, in a quiet sunrise, in the peace I hadn't felt in years. If you're still listening, maybe this isn't just my story. Maybe it's yours too. So take the first step. Reach out, whisper a prayer, or just breathe. And if this story touched something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to The Turning Point, because every week there's another story, another reminder that healing is real and hope is still alive. Click the bell, share this with someone who needs it. And remember, no matter how far you've fallen, grace is deeper still.